The first time Eliza Calloway sat down at the long pine table inside the Dusty Creek Ranch cookhouse, she ate exactly what was placed in front of her, said nothing, asked for nothing more, and quietly carried her tin plate to the wash bucket before anyone else had even thought about reaching for their bread. Cole Bridger noticed. He always noticed things like that. It was a habit built from years of reading country, reading weather, reading cattle and men, and the particular kind of silence that settled over the land right before something broke open. He had learned to pay attention the way a hawk pays attention, without blinking, without moving, without giving any sign that the watching was happening at all. And so when the new cook's assistant arrived at Dusty Creek Ranch on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879, riding up the hard-packed trail from the town of Millhaven, Texas, on the back of a borrowed mule, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and not much else to show for herself, Cole Bridger leaned against the corner post of the barn and watched her climb down with the careful dignity of a woman who was used to landing in unfamiliar places and making it look like she had always meant to be there. She was slender in a way that made something tighten in his chest when he thought about it later. Not the slenderness of fashion or of girlish delicacy, but the kind that came from not quite enough. Her dark hair was pinned back under a plain cotton bonnet, and her dress was clean, but worn so thin at the elbows that the afternoon light passed right through it. She had wide brown eyes that swept the ranch yard in one quick measuring glance, the kind of glance that told him she had learned long ago to take stock of every new place fast, to find the exits and the dangers before she found the comforts. Cole Bridger was 28 years old, 6'3", and built like a man the land itself had assembled from raw materials. Broad shoulders stacked with muscle that moved under his shirt with every small motion, forearms roped with veins, hands so large and calloused that they could grip a fence post and pull it from hard-packed earth without much ceremony. His dark hair touched the back of his collar and curled slightly where sweat and sun had worked it into waves, and there was a permanent shadow of stubble along his jaw that no amount of razor work seemed to fully clear. He had been the foreman of Dusty Creek Ranch for 3 years, ever since old Hector Dunning had decided his bones couldn't take another full working season and handed Cole the role with nothing more than a handshake and a bottle of whiskey shared on the porch at sundown. He pushed off the post and walked over to where the woman was standing with her canvas bag, looking at the main house with that same careful, assessing expression. "You the one Millhaven sent for the cookhouse?" he asked. She turned those wide brown eyes on him and held his gaze steadily. "I am. Eliza Calloway. Mrs. Haverford said there was work." "There is," he said. 12 hands, breakfast before sunup, supper at 6. Martha Greer runs the cookhouse. You answer to her." "I understand. You eaten today?" Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, not quite embarrassment, but something between the two, gone almost before it arrived. "I'm fine," she said, which was not an answer, but he let it stand because he had just met her, and pushing a woman he had just met seemed like a poor way to start things. "Cole Bridger," he said, and extended one of those large, weathered hands. She shook it without hesitation. Her grip was firmer than he expected. Her hand was small inside his, warm and rough with work, and he released it before he had time to think too much about the fact that he had not wanted to. That first evening at the table, he sat at the far end the way he always did. Foreman's spot, close enough to the door to stand and deal with things if things needed dealing with, far enough from the window to keep the setting sun out of his eyes. The hands came in loud and hungry, the way they always did, scraping benches back and reaching for the breadbasket and talking over each other about the fence work and the new bull and the question of whether it was going to rain on Friday. Martha Greer brought out the pot of beef stew herself, ladling it into bowls with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been feeding men for 40 years, and Eliza moved beside her in the narrow space behind the table, carrying the extra pot, the bread, the butter, the coffee. Cole watched her work. She was quick and quiet, and she anticipated Martha's movements in a way that suggested she had been doing this kind of labor since she was very young. She filled each bowl with even, practiced care. She topped off the coffee before anyone asked. When a hand named Davis knocked his bread onto the floor, she had a replacement piece in front of him before he had finished being embarrassed about it. When finally she sat down at the end of the bench, the last seat, the one nearest the door, the one that a person would sit in if they had been told they were allowed at the table but had not entirely believed it, She served herself from what remained in the pot. Cole watched the amount that went into her bowl. It was not very much. There was more in the pot. He had seen it. But she set the ladle down and she ate what she had, slowly, like someone making the most of a small thing. And when the bread basket came around, she took one piece. And when the coffee pot came around, she passed it to the man beside her without pouring for herself. And when the meal was over, she was the first one up, the first one moving, the first one at the wash bucket, and she asked for nothing. Not seconds, not coffee, not so much as a kind word. Cole drove that image around in his mind for the rest of the evening and most of the night. He had grown up poor enough to know what it looked like when someone had learned to want less so they would not be disappointed by getting less. He had done it himself, once, when he was a boy on his father's failing homestead in the scrubland north of San Antonio, when winters were lean and summer was no kinder, and you ate what was there, and you asked for nothing, because asking was a form of hoping, and hoping was something the land taxed you for. He had learned, the way children who grow up in the hard places learn, to make himself small at the table, to eat the right amount and take nothing extra, and say thank you and be gone before anyone could notice that you were still hungry. He had grown out of it. Years of ranch work, years of earning, years of eating enough until enough stopped feeling like a miracle. He had grown out of it. But he recognized it in her the same way you recognized an old scar on someone else's skin, the way you knew exactly how it had been made. The next morning, he was in the cookhouse before anyone else, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the ranch's ledger book, doing what he did every morning. Martha had the fire going and the biscuits in the oven, and she nodded at him in the way she always did. Not a greeting exactly, more of an acknowledgement that he was a fixture of the morning, like the cast-iron stove and the particular creak of the third floorboard. Eliza came in from the sleeping room at the back where Martha had given her a cot, dressed and pinned and ready, and she went straight to work without looking around for permission, which told him once again that she was someone who had never been able to afford the luxury of waiting to be asked. Cole watched her from behind his ledger and thought about what he was going to do. What he did was simple. When he ladled her bowl that first morning, he had moved himself to the serving position while Eliza was bringing out the eggs, and Martha had raised an eyebrow at this but said nothing. He filled the bowl the way he filled his own bowl. Full. Not overflowing, not a demonstration, just genuinely full, the way a person's bowl ought to be when there was plenty in the pot. He set it down at her place with a piece of biscuit and a cup of coffee already poured. She came to the table and looked at the bowl and then looked at him, and he was already looking back at the ledger. She sat down. She ate it, every drop. He did not make a thing of it. He did not say a word. He went on reading the ledger until the hands came in and things got loud and ordinary again, and then he ate his own breakfast and went out to the day. But he noticed. The way she had eaten, not with the frantic speed of someone afraid the food would be taken away, but with a slow, careful kind of attention, as though she was relearning the fact that there could be this much. That was what he saw. That slow, careful attention, like she was memorizing it. He gave her that same full bowl every morning after. Sometimes he was the one serving. Sometimes, when Martha noticed what he was doing and decided she approved, Martha's approval expressed itself, as it always did, through absolute silence on the subject. Martha did it for him. But the bowl was always full. The coffee was always there. The biscuit was always beside the plate, the butter soft and ready. Eliza never asked why. She never asked for seconds. But she stopped being the first one away from the table. A week after her arrival, Cole came into the cookhouse in the late afternoon to find her standing at the work table with her sleeves rolled up, cutting dried apple for a pie, and crying, silently. The tears were just running down her face the way water runs down a window, steady and quiet, and she kept cutting the apple. He stopped in the doorway. He thought about leaving. He thought about pretending he had not seen it. Then he thought about that first evening, that small bowl, that one piece of bread, that cup of coffee she had passed to someone else. He walked in. He pulled out a stool and sat down at the opposite end of the work table, and he picked up the extra knife and the apple at his end of the bowl, and he started cutting too. She glanced at him. The tears kept falling, but she didn't wipe them. Maybe she figured there was no hiding them by then. You don't have to talk, he said. I wasn't planning to, she said, and her voice was steady even if her face wasn't. All right, he said. They cut dried apple for a long time. The light in the cookhouse was amber and thick, the kind that belonged to late afternoons in Texas in April, and the fire in the stove snapped quietly. Somewhere outside, Davis and a hand named Purcell were arguing about the proper way to hang a gate. A horse was moving in the near pasture. The world was conducting its ordinary business. My husband died, Eliza said eventually. 7 months ago. He wasn't a good man, but he was. I thought he was mine, and now he is gone, and I am here, and sometimes I do not know what to do with that. Cole kept cutting apple. What was his name? Robert Calloway. She said it without warmth and without hate, which he thought might be the most honest relationship a person could have with a complicated grief. You have family? A sister in Virginia. We don't communicate. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. I made choices. She finally wiped her face with the back of her wrist. I'm not a sad woman. I'm just occasionally overcome. That seems reasonable, he said. She looked at him then, a real look, the kind that was looking for something specific. He let her look. He had nothing to hide from her, no performance he was maintaining, no angle he was working. He was just a man sitting in a cookhouse cutting dried apple because a woman was crying, and it seemed like the thing to do. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? The hands told me the foreman was hard. I am hard, he said. You don't seem it. The land is hard, he said. The work is hard. I run a tight operation because loose operations get men hurt. That's different from being cruel. She seemed to consider that. She turned back to her cutting. Robert was cruel, she said. Not always, but often enough. Cole said nothing. He let that sit in the room the way it needed to sit, heavy and real and undecorated, because she had put it there plainly, and it deserved plain acknowledgement rather than words rushing in to cover it over. After another long silence, she said, Why did you sit down here? You were crying. Most men would have left. I know, he said. That's why I didn't. She went very still for just a moment, and then she went on cutting the apple, and something in her shoulders dropped half an inch, as though a thread of tension she had been holding for a very long time had simply gone slack. Cole went out before the hands came in for supper, because he did not want to make anything of what had happened, and because he needed to think, and because thinking was a thing he did best on horseback, moving through the warm evening air with the land spreading out in every direction around him. He saddled Cutter, his bay quarter horse, and he rode the eastern fence line in the last of the light, and he thought about Eliza Calloway with her rolled sleeves and her steady voice and her careful eyes, and he thought, slow. He thought, careful. He thought, she is not a woman who needs rescuing. She is a woman who has been managing without rescue for a long time, and the difference matters. The weeks that followed were the best of that spring for the ranch. The grass was good, the cattle were settled, the spring rains had come in measured and useful amounts rather than the violent deluges that sometimes hit that part of Texas and turned arroyos into walls of moving brown water. The hands were in reasonable spirits. Martha Greer baked more pie than usual, which was always a barometric indicator of general goodness. Cole found himself engineering his days around certain moments in the cookhouse, not in a way anyone would have noticed. He was not a man who telegraphed things, but he made sure he was at the breakfast table when Eliza was there, and when he brought in wood for the cookhouse stove in the evenings, he was not in any particular hurry to leave. He started doing a thing where he brought one extra piece of cornbread to her place when the cornbread was good, setting it beside her plate before she sat down, and she started doing a thing where she saved him the last of the coffee, the strongest cup from the bottom of the pot that most of the hands didn't want, and left it waiting at his end of the table with a piece of cloth over the top to keep it warm. It was the kind of courtship the land produced, incremental, almost invisible, built from small attentions rather than speeches, structured around the reliable events of working days and shared tables. He thought about it sometimes, late at night in his bunk in the foreman's quarters, and it struck him as being exactly right for the both of them. She was not ready for declarations, he was not built for them, but they were building something, stone by stone, and he knew the shape it was taking. One evening in May, after supper, Eliza was sitting on the back step of the cookhouse in the warm dark, looking at the sky. The stars over the ranch were extraordinary at that time of year. Great washes of them, the Milky Way so clear and dense you could almost hear it. Cole came around the corner of the building and saw her there, and he stopped for a fraction of a second before he kept walking, unhurried. "Mind company?" he asked. She moved slightly to the left, which was an invitation, and he sat beside her on the step. Their shoulders nearly touched. The night air smelled of warm grass and the distant sweetness of blooming mesquite. "I've never seen so many stars in one place," she said. "I grew up in Georgia. There were trees. Does it bother you? The openness?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. It did at first. It felt like standing in the middle of something that didn't know you were there. But I think I am beginning to understand that is the point. The land doesn't notice you, and somehow that makes you feel free. She paused. Or maybe it makes you feel small, and I'm just deciding to call it free. "Those might be the same thing," he said. She turned her face toward him in the dark, and he turned toward her at the same moment, and they were very close, close enough that he could see the starlight reflected in her eyes, close enough that the warmth of her was a real thing he could feel along the side of his body. "Cole," she said, and his name in her mouth was something he filed away with great care. "Eliza," he said. They looked at each other in the dark for a moment that lasted the proper length of what it was, and then she turned back to the stars and he turned back to them too. And they sat there, in the good warm silence for a long time. He reached over, very slowly, and set his hand down on the step between them, and she looked at his hand, and then she set her own hand down beside it, and their little fingers touched. Neither of them moved after that. They just sat with that small point of contact in the dark, and it was more than enough, and they both knew it. The trouble came in June, the way trouble in 1879 Texas had a habit of coming, without much announcement and with a sense that it had been building for a while on the other side of some ridge you couldn't see over. A man rode into Dusty Creek Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon on a horse that was too good for the rest of his presentation, which was Cole's first observation about him. He was lean and neatly dressed in a way that said he wanted to look like money, even if the seams were showing, and he had the kind of eyes that were always calculating something. His name was Garfield Trace, and he said he was from the bank in Millhaven. He came to see Hector Dunning, the ranch's owner, who was old and largely confined to the house now, but whose mind was still sharp enough when he wasn't tired. Cole sat in on the meeting because Hector had long ago made it clear that he trusted Cole's read on people, and Cole's read on Garfield Trace was immediate and unfavorable. Trace laid out his business in careful, pleasant language. The ranch had debt. This was not news. Most ranches carried debt. That was the nature of cattle operations in Texas. And the bank had decided that it needed the debt serviced more aggressively than the current arrangement allowed. There was a particular piece of paper that Trace produced, which Hector squinted at, which Cole read over the old man's shoulder, which said in language that was pleasant right up to the moment it wasn't that the ranch had 90 days to bring the outstanding balance considerably closer to zero or begin discussions about alternative arrangements. Cole drove home the fence post of that meeting for the rest of the day. He knew what alternative arrangements meant. It meant Garfield Trace, or whoever Garfield Trace was fronting for, was making a play for the land. He didn't talk about it at supper because it wasn't the hand's business yet, and because Eliza's sharp eyes were on him the moment he came through the door, and he didn't want her to worry about something he hadn't yet figured out how to handle. But she was smart, and she had been watching him long enough by June to know his ordinary face from his carrying something face, and after the meal was cleared and the others had gone out, she put a cup of coffee in front of him at the empty table and sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. The lamp on the table between them threw warm light across her face, caught the dark threads in her hair, made shadows of her eyelashes on her cheekbones. "Ranch business," he said. "I figured that. I'm asking because you're sitting in your own skin like it doesn't fit you right tonight." He almost smiled at that. He told her about Trace and the paper and the 90 days. She listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup, her eyes on him the whole time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Hector can raise what's needed? If he sells some cattle early, before they're as fat as they ought to be. If the market in Abilene holds, if nothing goes wrong between here and there. Those are several ifs. Yes, he said. And if it doesn't work? He was quiet for a moment. I'm not planning for it not to work. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had reached for him first, the first time she had made the reaching deliberate and daylight rather than the quiet contact of two people pretending not to notice what they were doing. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. You'll figure it out, she said. You're not a man who lets things fall if there is any way at all to hold them. He looked at her hand in his and thought that she had no real reason to believe that yet, that she was saying it on faith built from a few months of watching, and that said something about the quality of her faith that he needed to be worthy of. I'll figure it out, he agreed, and the agreement was a promise he was making as much to himself as to her. He spent the next 2 weeks doing the math with Hector, planning the cattle drive to Abilene, negotiating the herd composition, deciding which animals to hold and which to sell, pulling in a favor from a neighboring rancher named Connors, who had a dozen steers he needed moved north anyway, and who agreed to add them to Cole's drive for a cut of the revenue. Cole assembled a crew of 8 hands, mapped the route, calculated the timing, and handled every logistical detail with the focused precision that had made him one of the most respected foremen in that part of Texas before he was 30. The night before the drive left, he found Eliza in the cookhouse after everyone else had cleared out, and she was packing trail food into saddlebags, cornbread, dried beef, hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and her movements had a brisk, purposeful quality that he recognized as her version of being worried and refusing to show it. I'll be back in 3 weeks, he said. I know, she kept packing. Martha will look after things here. I know that too. He crossed the room and she stopped packing and turned to face him, and he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. He raised one hand and put it along the side of her face, very carefully, the way you'd hold something you were afraid of breaking. Except that he was not afraid of breaking her. She was not breakable, he knew that. But he was afraid of her not wanting this, and he needed to move slowly enough that she had time to tell him. She did not tell him. She leaned into his hand. Eliza, he said quietly. Come back, she said. It wasn't please, it wasn't, I will miss you. It was just come back, and it was the most unguarded thing he had ever heard her say. I will, he said with absolute certainty, because he was a man who made promises he intended to keep. He kissed her forehead. Just that. His lips against the warm skin above her brow, gentle and deliberate and full of everything he intended to say at a later time, when he had the space for it, and she was ready for it, and the ranch was on solid ground. Then he stepped back, and she looked at him with those wide brown eyes that had stopped being careful with him and started being real, and he picked up the saddlebags. Save me the last of the coffee when I get back, he said. She almost smiled. Almost, which was better than nothing. It'll be cold by then. I'll take it, he said, and went out. The drive to Abilene took 19 days. It was not the worst drive Cole had made. The cattle were in good condition, the weather cooperated, the route was familiar. But it was not simple either. One day, a week into the drive, a thunderstorm rolled in from the northwest in the middle of the night, with the particular violence of a storm that had been gathering strength over open country and had nothing to stop it. And the cattle started moving, that initial shifting that a trail boss learned to feel in his bones before it became something else. Cole was on Cutter and moving before his mind had fully formed the thought, riding the edge of the herd in the black and sheeting rain, shouting to the hands over the thunder, keeping the pressure on the animals that wanted to break and run, holding the shape of the herd with the geometry of horses and riders and noise and will. They held them. Not perfectly. Some 30 head broke from the east flank and had to be rounded up in the gray morning after the storm passed. But they held the bulk of the herd together, and when the sun came up over miles of flat rain-washed Texas plain, Cole counted animals and counted men and found everyone accounted for, and he felt the deep bone-level satisfaction of a hard thing handled. A hand named Ortega, who had been riding with him for 2 years and was one of the most capable men on any cattle operation Cole had ever worked, pulled up beside him in the post-storm calm and said, "She must be something, that woman you left at the ranch." Cole looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "You haven't been this careful in years," Ortega said. "You've always been good." But now you're being careful." Cole thought about that. "She is," he said, and left it there. And Ortega nodded, and they turned their horses back toward the herd. He sold the cattle in Abilene at a price that was better than expected. The market had tightened due to a dry season further north, and Texan beef was selling strong. And he negotiated with the efficiency of a man who had done this enough times to know exactly where the other side's edges were, and he came away with an amount that, combined with what the ranch had on hand, would meet the bank's requirement with enough remaining to keep operations running through the summer. He rode back to Dusty Creek faster than the standard trail pace. He told himself it was because Hector would be anxious about the numbers. He told himself it was because there was a lot of work waiting at the ranch. He told himself all kinds of things, all of which were true, and none of which were the whole truth. He rode into the ranch yard on a Thursday evening, 19 days out, covered in trail dust and moving with the particular heaviness of a man who had been horseback more hours than not for nearly 3 weeks. He put Cutter up himself, because he always put Cutter up himself, and he washed his face at the pump and combed his fingers through his hair, and then he walked toward the yellow light of the cookhouse. Eliza appeared in the doorway before he reached it, which meant she had heard the horse, which meant she had been listening for it. She stood there with the warm light behind her and her arms loose at her sides, and she was looking at him the way people look at things they were worried about losing and are now relieved to see still whole. "You're back," she said. "Told you I would be," he said. She stepped back and he came inside. The cookhouse was warm and smelled of whatever she'd had on the stove, and there was a cup at his end of the table covered with a cloth. He sat down and lifted the cloth, and the coffee was cold, just as she'd promised. He drank it anyway because he had said he would. She sat across from him, and he told her the numbers from Abilene, and she listened with the focused attention she gave to everything important. And when he was done, she closed her eyes briefly with relief, and when she opened them again, she looked at him with something so naked and warm in her expression that he set the cup down very carefully. "Eliza," he said. "Cole," she said. "I need to tell you something." "All right?" He looked at his hands, those large, scarred, capable hands, and then he looked at her. "I don't have things to offer that look like much on paper. I have a foreman's wage and a room on someone else's ranch, and I am rough in most of the ways a person can be rough. But I have been. Since the day you arrived here, I have been thinking about you in a way that I think means something. And I am not a man who does things by half measures, so I want to be direct with you about it." She was very still. "I care about you," he said, "more than I know how to say without it coming out wrong. I care about you in a way that has a direction to it, forward. I don't want to be the foreman who you once worked beside at a ranch in 1879. I want to be more than that. I want to be who you come back to." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just telling you, because I think you deserve to know what you're working with." The silence stretched long enough that he felt it in his chest, and then she reached across the table and took both his hands in both of hers, and held them, and her thumbs moved over his knuckles in the way you touch something that matters. "Robert Calloway made me feel like a thing that took up inconvenient space," she said quietly. "For 3 years, I made myself smaller and quieter and less hungry for things because I had learned that wanting was dangerous, that hoping was something he could use against me." She looked at their joined hands. "And then I came here. And you gave me a full bowl, Cole. That was all it was at first, just a full bowl and a cup of coffee you'd kept waiting. And I cannot tell you what that did." Her voice went thin for just a moment. "It was such a small thing, and it was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years." He turned his hands in hers and held on. "You are not a man I am settling for," she said, looking up at him. "I want to be very clear about that. You are a man I am choosing." He stood up from the table, and she stood up with him, still holding his hands, and he looked down at her for a moment that was worth every cold day and hungry year and hard mile that had brought him to this particular cookhouse in Texas in 1879. And then he pulled her toward him gently, and she came without resistance, and he wrapped his arms around her the way you'd wrap something around, something precious, careful, and certain both at once. She pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her exhale, a long, slow release of something held for a long time, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stood like that in the warm cookhouse with the fire ticking down in the stove and the Texas night big and quiet outside. And he thought, this is it. This is the thing I've been working toward without knowing it. The rest of that summer was good. It was the kind of good that has texture and weight to it, not the thin good of luck, but the solid good of things being right. Cole and Eliza were quietly, steadily together in the way people are together on working ranches. No privacy for grand gestures, no time for elaborate romance, but an entire day full of small moments that added up to something larger than themselves. The coffee waiting, the full bowl, the evenings on the back step. The way she would come find him if something needed deciding, and he would listen to her the way he listened to everything important, with his full attention. The way he would notice, always noticing, if she had eaten enough, if she looked tired, if something was sitting on her the way old grief or new worry liked to sit. He noticed in July that she had started eating more. Not dramatically, not as a performance for him, but naturally, the way people eat when they have stopped being afraid of wanting things. She filled her bowl at supper without looking at how much was left for others. She took seconds on the nights the stew was good. She poured her own coffee. He watched this from across the table and felt something ease inside him, a knot he hadn't fully known was there, loosening. One evening she caught him watching and raised an eyebrow at him. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Nothing wrong," he said, and he meant it with everything he had. Garfield Trace came back to the ranch in late July, and this time Cole was ready for him. Hector had made the payment. The paperwork was in order. Cole met Trace at the gate, not at the house, a deliberate decision, and handed him the bank draft that Hector had signed, and watched the pleasant calculation behind Trace's eyes do its work. "Mr. Dunning is a man of his word," Trace said. "He is," Cole said. "So am I. This account is clear. I would consider it a favor if you found the bank's business needs in other directions." Trace looked at him. Cole stood with his arms loose at his sides and waited with the patience of a man who had all day and no inclination to shorten the meeting by being less than plain. "Of course," Trace said, and tucked the draft away and rode out of the ranch yard, and Cole watched until the dust of him was gone. He went inside and told Hector, who was sitting in his chair by the window with his hands folded over his middle, and Hector said, "Good. Good man." And then he closed his eyes, which was his way of ending a meeting. Cole stood in the hallway for a moment and thought about the ranch, the land, the cattle, the men who worked here, the cookhouse with its warm light. And he thought about Eliza, and about the fact that a man who was a foreman on someone else's land was in a particular kind of impermanence, the kind that could be disrupted by weather or death or the arithmetic of someone else's inheritance. He had been comfortable with that impermanence before. He was less comfortable with it now. He spent the next month thinking about land. There was a piece of it, 240 acres about 6 miles east of Millhaven, a section that had belonged to a family named Walsh, who had come out to Texas with high hopes in 1872 and been driven back east by drought and distance in 1876. The land had been sitting idle since then, which was a waste of good grass and a reliable seasonal creek. And Cole knew from the county records, he had made it his business to know from the county records, that it could be acquired for a reasonable price. Reasonable meaning the kind of price that would require everything he had saved in 3 years of foreman wages, plus a modest bank loan. He was not the kind of man who moved fast on large decisions, but he had been living with this idea long enough that it was no longer really a plan. It was a conclusion. He went to the land office in Millhaven on the first Tuesday of August, with his savings and his intention, and he sat down across from a clerk who smelled of tobacco and efficiency, and he started the process of becoming a man who owned land. He did not tell Eliza right away, not because he was hiding it. He had no interest in hiding things from her. He had no mechanism for it. She was too perceptive and he was too direct. But because he wanted it to be real first, all the paperwork signed and filed before he brought her into it. He thought she had had enough of things that were promises before they were facts. He wanted to give her the fact. The papers came through in September. He rode out to the Walsh land on a Sunday afternoon, just himself and Cutter, and he walked the property in the long golden light of an autumn Texas afternoon, and he counted the grass and the creek and the placement of the hills and the direction of the wind, and he thought about what it could be. He picked her up that Sunday evening, went to the cookhouse and told her he wanted to show her something, and she came without questions, which was one of the things he loved about her. He had saddled a gentle roan mare for her, and she rode with the careful confidence of someone who had ridden enough to know what they were doing without being a horsewoman by trade, and they rode east in the cooling afternoon air. He brought her to the high point on the land, where you could see the sweep of the grassland and the silver line of the creek, and on a clear day like this one, the faint dark edge of the hills to the north. "Whose land is this?" she asked. "Mine," he said, "as of 3 weeks ago." She turned to look at him on horseback, and the expression on her face was something he had never quite seen there before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. "Cole Bridger," she said, "you own land." "I do," he said. 240 acres, good grass, good water. I'm not leaving Hector until he has someone reliable, and that'll take time, but I'm planning to start building in the spring." She looked back at the land, and then back at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears and was not quite not. "What are you going to build?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I was hoping to discuss that with you," he said, and watched her understand exactly what he meant, watched it move across her face like light moving across open ground, warm and full and illuminating everything it touched. She did not look away. She held his gaze the way she held everything she had decided to keep. "I think," she said, "that the house should have a large kitchen." He breathed out. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. He proposed to her properly in October, which was after the harvest and before the worst of the fall work, on a Sunday evening on the back step of the cookhouse where they had first sat side by side looking at the stars. He did not have a ring, he had not been able to get to a jeweler yet, and he was not going to put off asking until a piece of metal was available. So he proposed with both his hands and everything in his voice that he had been holding for 6 months. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said. "Not because I need a woman for the ranch, or because it's the expected thing after a courtship. I am asking you because you are the person I want to sit beside for the rest of my life. And I do not want to sit beside anyone else. And I mean that as plainly as I know how to say it." She looked at him for a long moment, and he let her look. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Cole, I will marry you. And I mean that as plainly as I know how to say it, too." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised and full, and she laughed with him, and he put his arms around her in the dark, and she wrapped her arms around him, and they held on, and the stars were outrageous overhead, and the land was big and dark and good all around them. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly everything. They married in November of 1879 in the small Methodist church in Millhaven on a Saturday when the air was cold and clear and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only belongs to November in Texas. Martha Greer and the ranch hands came. Hector Dunning made the journey in the ranch wagon, which was more effort than he usually permitted his old bones, but he sat in the front pew in his Sunday coat and watched with the expression of a man who was satisfied with how something had turned out. Ortega was Cole's witness and stood at his side with his hat in his hands and a grin that he kept trying and failing to make smaller. Eliza wore a dress that Martha had helped her alter from a length of dark blue cotton she had picked out herself in Millhaven's dry goods store, and she walked down the aisle without anyone to give her away because there was no one to give her, which Cole had understood and accepted and quietly honored by the fact that he watched her walk toward him with the clear recognition that she was coming of her own volition, fully herself, not given or transferred, but chosen. She was beautiful. He had known she was beautiful for months, had been knowing it in the incremental way you know things you have been allowed to observe closely for a long time. But standing at the front of that church in his one good suit, watching her walk toward him in the blue dress with her dark hair down and her chin level and her eyes straight on his face, he felt it like a physical thing, the beauty of her, and more than that, the whole of her, the steadiness and the sharpness and the hard-won courage that was behind every measured word and every careful motion, and the softness she had started allowing him since she had decided he was safe enough for it. He took her hands when she reached him, and she held on. The minister said the words. Cole said his. Eliza said hers in a clear, even voice with not a waver in it, and when she got to the part about for as long as you both shall live, her grip on his hands went fractionally tighter, and his went tighter in answer. At the celebration afterward in Millhaven's one decent inn, Martha Greer produced a wedding cake that was a significant overachievement of effort given that she had had to bake it in the cookhouse oven and transport it in the ranch wagon. And Cole ate 2 pieces of it, and Eliza ate 2 pieces as well. And he looked at her across the table with those 2 pieces and felt something so simple and so complete that he had no particular word for it. He filed it as happiness, the undecorated kind. That night, in the room above the inn that they had taken for 2 nights, a small luxury he had insisted on because he was not beginning their married life in a bunkhouse, he lay beside her in the dark, and she was tucked against his side with her head on his chest and his arm around her. And they talked for a long time about small things, about the kitchen she wanted, and the horses he was planning, and the name they had been half discussing for the property. Calloway Creek, she said at one point, and then, no, that doesn't feel right anymore. Bridger's Reach, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Bridger's Reach, she repeated, tasting it. Yes, that's it. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She shifted closer, which he had not thought was possible. Cole, she said. Right here, he said. I know, she said. That's what I'm saying. You are right here. A pause. I haven't had that before. Someone who is right here. He held her tighter. I am not going anywhere, he said. I believe you, she said, and the quiet confidence of it, no more careful measuring, no more guarding, told him everything about how far she had come from the woman who had arrived on a borrowed mule with a canvas bag and a practiced invisibility. Sleep, he said. We've got a full life ahead of us. She settled. He stayed awake a little longer, listening to her breathing even out, feeling the weight and warmth of her against his side, and he looked at the ceiling of that small room above the inn in Millhaven, Texas, and he felt the full, settled weight of a man who had found the thing he was working toward and had his hands on it now and was not letting go. They moved into a temporary arrangement at the ranch while Cole began work on Bridger's Reach in the spring of 1880. Hector had secured a new foreman by February, a capable man from Laredo named Vasquez, who Cole spent 2 months training and briefing with the thoroughness of someone who had built something and wanted it to stay built after he was gone. Cole stayed on through March to ensure the transition was solid, and Hector paid him a departure bonus that he had not asked for and would not have asked for, but Hector had pressed it on him with the manner of a man settling a debt. You kept this place together for 3 years, Hector said, not just with your hands, with your head. This is what that's worth. Cole shook his hand and didn't argue. Building the house at Bridger's Reach took most of that spring and summer. He did much of it himself, because he could, because the physical work of building a thing that was meant to last was deeply satisfying in a way he had always understood, and because every beam and board he raised with his own hands was a conversation between him and the land about what he intended. Ortega came out on weekends and helped with the heavy work, and 2 other men from the old ranch crew lent their labor for the raising of the walls, which was a gesture of friendship that Cole accepted and remembered. Eliza was there for all of it. She cooked for the building crew out of a camp kitchen set up in the shade of the one large live oak on the property, and she measured and decided and debated the placement of windows with Cole in the evenings with the serious focus of someone who had given significant thought to how light moved through a house and what that meant for the work done inside it. The kitchen was large. He had made sure of that from the first drawing. Large, with good north light and a window over the work counter that looked out over the creek, and a stove that was the best one available through Millhaven's general store. When he showed her the kitchen for the first time, properly finished, the stove in place, the shelves built, the window looking out over the water, she stood in the center of it and turned slowly, and he stood in the doorway and watched her take it in. It's everything I wanted, she said. Almost, he said. There's more to put in it. We'll get there. She came to him and put both hands on his chest, and he looked down at her upturned face, and the expression there was one he had been cataloging since the beginning. This one was pure and whole, and without any shadow of the careful hiding she had once maintained over everything she felt. "You give me things," she said. "You are always giving me things." "You deserve them," he said simply. "Most people don't think about what other people deserve," she said. "I know," he said. "I think it's the most important thing to think about." She kissed him then, warm and certain, standing in her new kitchen with the creek light coming through the window and the summer morning all around them, and he held her the way he had held her on their wedding night and on every night after, with the specific gravity of a man who knew exactly what he had and was not taking any of it for granted. By autumn of 1880, they had their first cattle, 20 head of good breeding stock purchased from a ranch near San Marcos, moved up to Bridger's Reach on a mild October day, with Ortega's help and much commentary from Ortega about the quality of Cole's choices. Cole had taken on a hired hand as well, a young man of 20 named Henry Perkins, who had come looking for work and who had impressed Cole within the first 10 minutes by identifying a problem with a wagon wheel that 2 other men had missed. Henry lived in the small bunkhouse Cole had built at the eastern edge of the property, ate his meals at the house with Cole and Eliza, and was treated accordingly, which meant, among other things, that Eliza filled his bowl the same way she filled Cole's and made sure there was always enough. Henry Perkins, 20 years old and about as unsentimental as young men from West Texas tend to be, told Ortega when they were working a fence line one December morning, "I have worked 3 ranches, and I have never once seen a foreman's wife who treated the help like they mattered." Ortega, who was helping as a favor and was therefore not technically the help, said, "She had someone treat her like she didn't matter for a long time. Makes people either mean or generous. She came out generous." Henry thought about this. "That's lucky for us," he said. "Lucky for everybody," Ortega agreed. That winter was cold by Texas standards, not the killing cold of the high plains or the ice storms that shut down operations further north, but cold enough to ice the creek at its edges and to make the cattle press together in the mornings and to fill the house with the particular good smell of a wood stove working hard. Cole and Eliza fell into the rhythms of their life at Bridger's Reach with the ease of people who had been waiting to find the shape they fit into and had found it at last. He woke early, made the fire, made coffee. She came out in the cold morning dark, and they sat together with their coffee for half an hour before the day's demands arrived, and this half hour was sacred in the way that small recurring things become sacred when you build a life around them. It was theirs, and it was good, and it happened every morning. She was reading more than she had. She had told him once, quietly, that Robert had not liked her reading, had considered it a kind of avoidance, and so she had stopped. Cole had said nothing, had simply ridden into Millhaven on a Friday and come back with 3 books from the dry goods store's small collection, set them on the kitchen table, and said nothing at all. By the new year, she had found a way to order books through the store from a supplier in Austin, and the stack on her nightstand was a reliable indicator of how the ranch was going. When things were busy, it shrank. When things settled, it grew. And he loved both versions. She told him in February of 1881 that she was pregnant, on a morning when the creek was running high with winter melt and the cattle were moving well in the pasture below the house, and Henry was out mending a section of fence that the December ice had damaged. She told him simply, standing at the kitchen stove with a coffee cup in her hand and the north light on her face, and she watched him with those steady brown eyes as the information settled into him. He set down his own cup and crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and she waited. And then he kissed her carefully on the forehead, and both cheeks and her mouth, and he held her for a long time, and she felt him breathing, slow and deep, the way he breathed when he was taking something in properly. "Are you all right?" he asked against her hair. "Very all right," she said. "Are you?" He pulled back enough to look at her. His eyes were bright. "I have never been. I don't have the word for what I am right now," he said, which was the most completely honest thing a man could say. "Neither do I," she said, "but I think it's something very good." The baby came in October of 1881, early in the month when the Texas heat had just begun to relent and the mornings had that first clean edge of autumn to them. Cole had ridden hard into Millhaven to bring back the doctor, a competent man named Aldridge, who had been practicing in that part of Texas for 15 years and who had seen enough to be unflappable about most things. Martha Greer had come out for the occasion. She had been a regular visitor to Bridger's Reach since the marriage, riding out on Sundays with the frequency of a woman who had decided that Eliza was her business and was not asking anyone's permission about it. It was a boy, 7 pounds, healthy, with a full head of dark hair like his mother's, and a grip, when Cole put one finger into that small fist, that was as determined as anything Cole had ever encountered. Strong, Dr. Aldridge observed. Of course, Martha said, as though anything else would have been unreasonable. Cole sat on the edge of the bed beside Eliza, who was tired in the way that follows extraordinary effort and who was looking at the baby in his arms with an expression that he had no inventory for. It was entirely new, this expression, belonging to this specific moment and no other. He looked back and forth between his wife's face and his son's face, and he felt something that was too large for his chest and was expanding anyway, pressing at every edge, and he thought, "We made this. This is ours." "What do we call him?" he asked. Eliza reached out and touched the baby's cheek with one finger. "James," she said. "James Henry Bridger." Henry for their hired hand who had driven into Millhaven for the doctor and then spent the next 8 hours quietly doing every piece of work on the ranch because he didn't know what else to do with his nervousness. "James Henry Bridger," Cole said. He raised his eyes to find Eliza watching him, and she had tears on her face, not the silent, private tears of that first afternoon in the cookhouse, but open ones, unhidden and unashamed, tears that belonged entirely to a happiness she was not reducing or containing. "Come here," he said, and she leaned against him with the baby between them, and he put one arm around her shoulders and kept the other around James, and he held them both, and the room was warm, and the autumn morning was outside the window, and everything that had been built, the land, the house, the cattle, the table that always had enough on it, the life that was the answer to all those lean years of making himself small and hoping less. It was all here, all real, all solid under his hands. Henry Perkins, when he was finally allowed in to see the baby late that evening, looked at James for a very long moment and then said, "He's red." "All babies are red," Martha told him. "He'll even out," Cole said. Henry nodded with the sober gravity of a 20-year-old processing information about which he had no experience. Then he said, "James Henry is a very good name," and left quickly before anyone could make too much of the fact that he was clearly moved by it. The ranch grew in the years that followed in the way that good operations grow when they are run by people who know what they are doing and who care about the work. Cole added cattle methodically, bought an additional 40 acres when the land adjacent to the eastern fence came available in 1882, and built his reputation in the region as a man who ran a clean, honest operation and whose word was exactly what his word was. He was known in Millhaven and at the County Cattle Association as someone who did not oversell and did not underdeliver, which in that time and place was a reputation worth more than most things. Eliza had developed, alongside the domestic life of the ranch, something that Martha Greer had recognized and encouraged from the beginning. A talent for the specific economics of feeding people well on a practical budget, for knowing what to plant and when, for running the kitchen garden and the root cellar and the smokehouse with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything. She had started trading preserves and dried goods with neighboring homesteads, and the network of women who came to the door or met her at the Millhaven market on Saturdays was a social world she had built entirely by herself, from nothing, in the way she had built everything important in her life, carefully, steadily, with her own hands. There were things she did not talk about often, but that Cole knew were there. The years with Robert, the loneliness of Georgia after her parents died, the sister who had stopped writing. He did not press on these places because she was not a woman who needed pressing. She was a woman who arrived at things on her own time, and his job was to be there when she did. She arrived one evening in the fall of 1882, after James had been put to bed and Henry had gone to the bunkhouse and the fire was settled, at the subject of her sister. She was sitting with her mending and he was reading, and she said without particular preamble, "I think I should write to Catherine." He looked up. "All right," he said. "She may not answer." "She may not," he agreed. "But I have. Things are good here. I have things I want someone in my family to know about." She paused. James should know he has an aunt. Write to her, he said. She did. Catherine wrote back, 3 months later, from Virginia, in a letter that was stiff at first and warmer by its second page, and which said, among other things, that she had been wondering about Eliza for years and was relieved to hear she was safe and settled. The correspondence grew slowly over the following year, and Catherine came to visit in the summer of 1884, rode the train to San Antonio, and then came up to Millhaven by stagecoach, a journey that she described in the letter announcing it as an adventure, and in person as rather more than she had bargained for, said with the specific Virginia accent of their shared childhood that made Eliza go very still for a moment when she first heard it, as though she was listening to something she had not realized she missed. Cole liked Catherine. She was sharp and dry and said exactly what she thought with no particular apology for the thinking of it. And she looked at Cole over the supper table on the first evening of her visit with the frank assessment of a woman deciding whether her younger sister had made a good choice, and whatever she found in the looking satisfied her, because she relaxed after that in a way that was visible and said, "Eliza speaks very highly of you in her letters. I had thought she was managing the truth a bit, but I see she was not." Cole raised his coffee cup toward her. "She has a habit of seeing things clearly," he said. "Yes," Catherine said. "She always did. Robert Calloway was the one time she was persuaded not to, and I should have fought harder against that." A pause. "I've thought about it a great deal." "Don't," Eliza said simply. "It's done. Look at what came after." What came after was spread around the supper table. Cole and Eliza and James, now a 3-year-old with his father's broad jaw and his mother's eyes, and Henry Perkins eating his supper with the comfortable ease of a man who had been part of this household long enough to stop being a guest in it, and the smell of Eliza's beef stew filling the room the way it filled the room every evening, and the particular lamplight of autumn at Bridger's Reach, making everything warm. Catherine cried a little, looking at it. She wiped her face briskly and said it was the trail dust from the stagecoach, and nobody believed her, but Cole refilled her coffee and passed the bread without comment, which was the appropriate response. The second baby came in 1884, in December, a girl this time, born in the same bedroom as James, but in a winter instead of autumn, with snow on the ground. For the first time anyone at Bridger's Reach could remember, a freak Texas snow that dusted the grass white and made the cattle stand in confused, steaming groups in the early morning. Catherine, who was still visiting, her visit had extended considerably beyond its original 2 weeks by mutual agreement, proved unexpectedly capable in the birthroom, something she attributed to years of nursing her mother through a long illness. They named her Rose Catherine Bridger, for the woman who had been at her arrival and for the reconciliation she represented. She was small and loud, and had from the beginning an opinion about everything, which Cole said came from her mother, and Eliza said came from her father, and they were probably both right. James, 3 years old, and considering the matter seriously, said of his new sister, "She is very loud." He then sat beside her in Eliza's arms for an extended period, watching her the way his father watched things, with complete unblinking attention, and by the end of the day had declared himself her protector in the informal but absolute way of 3-year-old boys, which everyone found very serious and very correct. Cole held Rose that first evening with the same overwhelming feeling he had had with James, and the feeling was the same in quality but doubled somehow, or deepened, because this was the second time he had been given this, the second time the impossible ordinary miracle of a new person had happened under this roof, and the accumulation of it pressed on him in the best possible way. He looked at Eliza, tired and warm in the bed with Catherine beside her, and the baby recently returned to her arms, and he said, "You are remarkable." She looked at him with those brown eyes that had not been careful with him in years. "So are you," she said. "Come sit with me." He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and Catherine tactfully found other business, and the fire was going, and the snow was outside, and the baby was making small, alive sounds in Eliza's arms, and Cole thought about that first evening, the cookhouse, the long table, the thin arms and the small bowl, and the careful eyes of a woman who had taught herself not to want. And he thought about this, now, all of this, the land and the house and the children and the woman who had brought herself fully to life in the space he had tried to give her, who had turned a full bowl of stew into this, all of this. 5 years of building forward into something real and lasting and theirs. He said nothing. He just held on, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand touching the top of Rose's dark downy head very gently. And he listened to the fire and the snow silence and the breathing of his family. The years continued to unfold at Bridger's Reach with the reliable richness of a good life steadily lived. James grew into a serious, capable boy who followed Cole around the ranch from the time he could walk a full mile without stopping, learning the names of things, asking questions that Cole answered with the same complete attention he gave to everything important. By the time James was 6, he could identify most of the cattle by sight and had strong opinions about horses. Eliza taught him to read from the books she ordered from Austin, and he was a quick study, the kind of child who went through material fast and then looked around for more, which Eliza understood exactly, having been that kind of child herself. Rose was her own creature entirely, loud and funny and physically fearless in a way that made Cole's heart seize on a fairly regular basis as she climbed things and jumped from things and declared herself capable of all of it before she had entirely demonstrated that she was. She had Catherine's dry sense of humor and Eliza's stubborn precision and Cole's absolute conviction that whatever needed doing was within her capacity to do, and she was a handful in the way that gifts sometimes are, the kind that demand your full attention and give back more than they take. Henry Perkins married a young woman from Millhaven named Sarah in 1885. She was a school teacher, dark-eyed and practical, who had come out to Millhaven from New Mexico to take the teaching position and had met Henry at the Millhaven market on a Saturday and made her assessment of him with the same efficiency she applied to curriculum planning. Cole attended the wedding with Eliza and the children, and he watched Henry stand at the front of the church with his hat in his hands and his honest face completely open to the moment. And he remembered standing in that same position himself, in that same church, and he reached over without thinking and took Eliza's hand. She squeezed it. She knew what he was thinking. She usually did. Sarah Perkins joined the network of women that Eliza had built around her, and she brought to it the school teacher's habit of organization and the New Mexican's knowledge of preservation techniques that Eliza hadn't encountered, and they became friends of the kind that share knowledge and argue productively about the best way to put up peaches, which was the kind of friendship the land produced, useful and deep and built on practical shared experience. Cole and Henry, who had been in an employer-employee relationship that had gradually evolved into something more like partnership, formalized things in 1886 with a small stake that Cole gave Henry in the cattle operation. It was not a large stake, the ranch was not large enough to split in any significant way, but it was a recognition of what Henry had contributed and what he meant to the place, and Henry accepted it with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what was being offered and why. "You didn't have to do this," Henry said. "I know," Cole said. "That's not the relevant point." Henry looked at the paper and then at Cole. "What is the relevant point? You've been here since the beginning of this place. You're part of it. That should mean something in how things are structured." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're a strange man, Cole Bridger." "Probably," Cole agreed. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know," Cole said. "I took it as one." The summer of 1887 was hot, as Texas summers were, and dry in the way that always sharpened the edge of ranching in that country. The creek still ran, which was the great advantage of Bridger's Reach, but the grass turned early and the cattle moved toward the water more than usual, and Cole spent more time on horseback than he had since the driving days, managing the herd's access to the good pasture and keeping a careful eye on the sky. There were some losses, small ones, the kind that could not be entirely prevented when the land went dry, but nothing that threatened the operation. And by September, the rains came back and the grass recovered, and the creek that had shrunk in August was running full and bright again by October. Eliza, in that dry summer, did a thing that he had not expected and that he should have expected, which was that she organized the women of the surrounding homesteads into a cooperative arrangement for sharing water access at the creek during the drought. She did it the way she did everything, quietly, with complete competence, without asking anyone's permission or making it a formal thing. She simply talked to neighbors, arranged times, drew up a rotation on a piece of paper, and made it happen. By midsummer, 3 families who might have been in serious difficulty had access to water they needed, and none of it had required politics or meetings or argument. Cole found out about it not from Eliza but from a man named Garza, whose homestead was 2 miles south, who stopped Cole at the Millhaven market in August and said, "Your wife is the reason my cattle are alive right now. I want you to know that." Cole looked at the man and thought about Eliza in the cookhouse in 1879, passing the coffee pot to someone else without pouring her own cup, and he said, "She is generous by nature." "She's more than that," Garza said. "She's capable. There's a difference." "There is," Cole agreed. He told her what Garza had said that evening on the porch they had built on the south side of the house, where the light was good in the late afternoon. She was sitting with mending, because there was always mending, and she listened to him with her eyes on the needlework, and then she was quiet for a moment. "He said that?" she asked. "Word for word." She kept sewing. He watched the slight upward curve of her mouth, barely there, gone as quickly as it came, the specific expression of a person receiving something they did not let themselves want too openly. He moved his chair closer to hers, because the afternoon light was exactly right, and because the children were inside with Sarah Perkins, who had come for the afternoon, and because after 8 years he had lost no interest in being close to her. If anything, the interest had grown in the particular way of things that prove themselves over time, that become more true the longer you know them. She looked at him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Moving my chair," he said. "I can see that. Is there an objection?" She shook her head, and the small smile came back and this time stayed, and she went on with her mending while he sat close enough that their arms touched, and the afternoon settled around them with the particular quality of a late summer Texas evening, warm and a little dusty and full of cricket sound, and everything was where it was supposed to be. In 1888, Cole and Eliza expanded the house, not because it was necessary in the urgent sense, but because it was right. James was 7 and Rose was 3, and a new baby was arriving in the spring, and the bedroom situation required a different geometry. Cole and Henry and 2 hired men spent the better part of that February and March adding a wing to the north side of the house that gave them 2 more rooms, and Cole built the shelves in the new children's room with the same care he had put into everything at Bridger's reach, tight corners and smooth boards and enough room for the books that would inevitably fill them. The new baby arrived in April 1888, another boy, Thomas William Bridger, healthy and loud with Cole's dark eyes and the particular look of determined concentration that James had also had, as though being born was serious business that deserved serious attention. James, now 7, received his second sibling with the gravity of a senior statesman and immediately began explaining the ranch to Thomas, who was 3 days old and absorbing this information from a position of being asleep. Cole, sitting on the edge of the bed with Eliza while James conducted his orientation briefing in the corner, said softly, "3." "3," she agreed, and there was a note of wonder in her voice, quiet wonder, the kind she still had for the size of her life, for the distance between what she had once made herself believe she was worth and what she had been given. "Are you overwhelmed?" he asked. "Completely," she said, "in the best possible way." He looked at her and thought, "I have been giving you full bowls for 9 years, and you are still surprised by them." He thought, "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know you deserve them." He thought all of this and said nothing, because some things were better carried as intention than announced as declaration, and because she knew. She had always been perceptive enough to know. By 1890, Bridger's Reach was a proper going concern. 180 head of cattle, good horses, a kitchen garden that Eliza had expanded into something that supplied not just the household, but a regular selling at the Millhaven market, 3 ranch hands in addition to Henry, a bunkhouse that Cole had rebuilt larger in 1889, and a reputation in the county for the kind of solid, dependable operation that banks like to lend to and neighbors like to have nearby. Cole was 39. He had the look of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life, weathered and strong, the muscles of his shoulders and arms still as formidable as they had ever been, but with a settled ease in his body now, the ease of a man who knows where he stands. His dark hair had a thread or two of gray in it, which Eliza told him made him look distinguished, which he told her was kind of her to say, which she told him was not kindness, but fact, which he told her she was biased, and she had agreed without any particular remorse. He still woke early and made the fire and made coffee. She still came out in the early dark, and they sat together with their coffee before the day arrived. This had not changed. It was one of the fixed things, reliable as sunrise, and he counted on it the way he counted on the creek and the good grass and the cattle, knowing where the water was. One morning in the autumn of 1890, sitting with their coffee in the gray pre-dawn with the house quiet around them, she said, "Do you remember the first time you gave me a full bowl?" He looked at her over his cup. "Yes," he said. "I went back to my cot that night and I thought, what is that man doing? I do not know what to do with a man who pays that kind of attention." She shook her head slightly. "I almost convinced myself it was an accident." "It wasn't," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it within a week. It was every morning, and then the coffee and then the extra biscuit, and you never said a word about it. You just gave." He looked at her steadily. "What else would I do?" "Most people," she said, "do not ask what someone needs. They give what is convenient, or they give what makes them feel generous, which is not the same as what is needed." She held her coffee cup in both hands. "You gave what was needed. You saw exactly what was needed, and you gave it, quietly, without fanfare, without wanting anything back for it. And that is, Cole, that is a very rare thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You made it easy," he said finally. "You make it very easy to want to give you things. You are appreciative, Eliza, in the true sense of that word. You receive things with the full weight of what they mean. That is not common either." She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were the same eyes they had been in 1879, wide and brown and observant, but what was in them now was entirely different from what had been there on that first day. Then there had been assessment, measurement, the careful wariness of a woman who had learned to take stock before she trusted. Now there was just him, reflected back, the full accounting of 11 years of someone seeing her and giving her the room to grow into all the things she had been making herself too small for. "I love you," she said, and it was not something they rarely said. They said it often, in the ordinary passing way of people who mean it and have stopped being afraid to say it. But this morning it carried the whole weight of everything behind it, of Georgia and Robert Calloway, and the borrowed mule, and the cookhouse, and the full bowl, and the land, and the children asleep in the rooms above them, and the 11 years of this coffee in the early dark. He reached over and covered her hand with his. "Well, I love you," he said back with the same weight, "every single day." Outside, the first thin light of the Texas morning was beginning at the edge of the sky, the gray softening toward amber, the cattle in the pasture below becoming visible as dark shapes moving slowly through the early mist, the creek catching the first light and throwing it back in pieces. A horse moved in the barn. A bird began somewhere. The day was arriving the way good days arrived, without hurry, without announcement, simply there, filling in from the edges. Cole and Eliza sat in their kitchen with their coffee and watched the morning come, and James would be up soon, and Rose and Thomas, and there was work waiting in the way. There was always work at a working ranch, and Henry would come over from the bunkhouse, and Sarah would bring the new baby she and Henry had welcomed last March, and Martha Greer would probably appear at some point, because she had never entirely stopped being present in their lives, which neither of them had ever objected to. All of that was coming. All of that was good. But for now it was just the two of them in the first minutes of a morning, and Cole Bridger, who had noticed 11 years ago that a woman never asked for seconds, held his wife's hand across the kitchen table and thought about everything a person's life could grow into when someone paid the right kind of attention at the right time, when someone decided that full was the correct default, that giving without condition was not a strategy or a transaction, but simply the right way to move through the world alongside another person. He had been right about her from the very first evening. He had known it the way he knew weather and cattle and the disposition of the land, instinctively, certainly, with the full-body conviction of a man who had learned to trust his reading of the world. And she had been right about him. He had stayed right here. He had not gone anywhere. In the spring of 1891, they planted a kitchen garden larger than any they had planted before, because Eliza had an idea about expanding the market arrangement, and Cole built her 3 new raised beds against the south wall of the house, and then stood back while she organized them with the pleased focus of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. James, 9 years old and deeply interested in growing things since Cole had let him run a small section of pasture grass as an experiment the previous year, worked beside her with a serious commitment to the project. Rose planted things in the wrong places and was unrepentant about it, and some of them grew anyway, which Rose took as confirmation of her general approach to the world. Thomas, 2 years old, ate dirt on one occasion, which the family doctor in Millhaven said was quite normal for 2-year-olds, which Cole filed as information he wished he had had before the incident. Henry and Sarah's baby, a boy named Jack who was 8 months old and had Henry's chin and Sarah's dark eyes, was developing opinions about everything with impressive speed. Martha Greer came on a Sunday in April and sat at the large table in the kitchen of Bridger's Reach and ate a piece of pie that Eliza had made from the first of the winter apples kept in the root cellar, and she looked around the kitchen, the good north light, the full shelves, the children's drawings pinned to the board Cole had made for that purpose, the boots by the back door in 3 sizes, the particular accumulated comfortable lived-in substance of a house that was a home, and she said, "This is right." Eliza set down her coffee cup. "Yes," she said, "it is." "You are happy," Martha said. It was not a question. "I am happy," Eliza said. "I have been. I am happy in a way I did not know was available to me. I thought, for a long time, I thought that what I had was the full range of what I could have. I thought small was safe, and safe was enough." "And now?" Martha asked. Eliza looked through the kitchen window at the pasture below the house, where Cole was working a horse on the long line in the morning light, that great solid shape of him moving with the easy authority of a man entirely in his element, and beyond him the land of Bridger's Reach spread wide and green and genuinely theirs. "Now I think," Eliza said, "that the full bowl was only the beginning." Martha Greer made a sound that was not quite an utterance and not quite silence, the sound of someone whose faith in the world has been confirmed, and she picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and looked at the same view. Cole finished working the horse and turned and looked toward the house, which he did when the direction of the work allowed it, just a check, a look, the automatic orientation of a man who is always aware of where his people are. He could not have seen Eliza in the kitchen window from that distance, but he turned anyway, and he raised one hand in the particular way he had always had. Not a wave exactly, more of a recognition. "I know you're there. I'm here," and she raised her own hand in answer, even though he could not see it. She stood there in the north light of her kitchen with Martha Greer and her coffee and her books and her children, and she thought about a Tuesday morning in 1879, a borrowed mule, a canvas bag, the practice of making herself invisible so she would not be inconvenient, the long habit of not asking for seconds. She thought about a man who had noticed and had said nothing, and had simply started giving her firsts that were twice the size they needed to be, over and over, quietly, persistently, without ever once requiring her to ask. She thought about the life that had come from that, the full bowl, and then the land, and then the house with the good north light, and then James and Rose and Thomas in their rooms above, and the mornings with coffee in the dark, and the hand that had been reaching for hers since that first night on the back step when their little fingers touched, and they had both pretended not to notice. She thought, it turned out that full was not a temporary state or a luxury or a thing you had to earn in some final definitive way. It turned out that full was just the right size. It turned out that this was what a life looked like when someone saw you truly and gave you the space to grow into the size you were actually supposed to be. Outside, Cole Bridger turned back to his horse and the good work of the morning, and the Texas spring was all around him, and Bridger's Reach lay broad and alive in every direction, and he was exactly where he had always been, working toward being, and it was fine and full, and finally and completely and irreversibly enough.